No one in Harlan County would admit it later. But the night the worst winter storm in decades swallowed the plains, every single one of them ended up staring at the same thing through the ice-choked dark. A dull, steady light glowing from inside a rusted grain silo they had spent months laughing at. A place they had called foolish, paranoid, even unlivable, because long before the storm arrived, before the temperature plunged low enough to freeze diesel in its lines and crack wood like glass, before the power failed and the roads vanished beneath drifts that erased direction itself, Mara Ellison had already seen something coming, something no forecast quite captured, and instead of reinforcing a house like everyone else, she bought the one structure in the county nobody wanted. It began quietly enough, the way most strange things do in small towns, with a single rumor passing through the co-op on a slow afternoon. Someone mentioning that the old Grady farm had finally sold after sitting untouched for nearly a decade, its fields too flat and too exposed to interest serious buyers, its buildings collapsing into themselves from years of neglect, and at the center of it all, that silo, tall, cylindrical, streaked with rust and bent slightly from years of prairie wind, had always been considered more liability than asset, something that would need to be torn down before the land could ever be useful again, which was why it didn't make sense when word spread that Mara Ellison had paid cash for the entire property without negotiation, without inspection delays, without even attempting to reduce the price. Mara wasn't from far away, but she wasn't exactly part of the town either, the kind of person people recognized without really knowing. Someone who had rented a small place on the edge of town for a few years, worked seasonal jobs, kept to herself, and spoke only when necessary. And while that alone was enough to make people curious, it wasn't until the trucks started arriving that curiosity turned into conversation, because Mara didn't show up with demolition crews or scrap buyers like most expected. She brought engineers, contractors, and materials that looked far too expensive for what everyone assumed was a teardown project. The first thing she did was clear the inside of the silo completely, hauling out decades of dust, broken mechanisms, and leftover grain residue until the hollow core stood bare and echoing. And then instead of cutting it apart, she reinforced it, welding steel braces along the interior walls, sealing weak points, and laying down a foundation slab that extended deeper than anyone thought necessary. And that was when the comments started picking up, because people in Harlan County understood practical building, barns, houses, sheds, but this didn't follow any pattern they recognized, especially when Mara ordered thick insulation panels usually reserved for industrial cold storage and had them installed layer by layer inside the curved walls, reducing the usable space but increasing density in a way that seemed excessive, even obsessive. "She's turning it into a freezer," one man joked at the diner, drawing a few laughs, while another shook his head and said, "No windows, no proper roof work. She's not building anything you'd want to live in." And across town, at the gas station where conversations tended to sharpen into opinions, someone suggested she was preparing for something, though no one could say exactly what. And that uncertainty only made the jokes easier, because it's always simpler to laugh at what you don't understand than to question it. Meanwhile, Mara continued without interruption, replacing the narrow exterior ladder with a reinforced entry system at ground level, a heavy steel door set into a frame that looked more suited to a storm shelter than a residence. And then, without announcement or explanation, she began altering the landscape itself, hiring trucks to deliver soil, load after load, until the base of the silo was no longer exposed but gradually buried, the earth packed tight around it in a sloping rise that blended into the flatness of the surrounding land, transforming the structure from something tall and visible into something anchored and partially hidden. And that was the point where people stopped pretending it was normal, because whatever she was building, it clearly wasn't meant to be seen the way houses usually are. "She's burying it," someone said, not quite joking this time. And another replied, "Why would anyone bury a perfectly good structure unless they're trying to hide from something?" But the question didn't lead to answers, only more speculation, because Mara never offered explanations, never invited anyone to look inside, never corrected the assumptions forming around her, and instead focused on details no one else noticed, like the placement of narrow ventilation shafts angled downward instead of outward, designed to block wind rather than invite airflow, or the installation of internal systems that required careful calibration, battery storage, water containment, heat sources that didn't rely on external fuel lines. All of it hidden within the thickening shell of the silo until, by late autumn, the structure had changed so completely that it barely resembled what it once was, no longer an abandoned relic, but something deliberate, something engineered, though for what purpose remained unclear. The final weeks before winter settled and brought the most visible transformation, as the outer soil was compacted and reinforced with native grasses, blending the silo into the prairie so effectively that from a distance it looked less like a building and more like a natural rise in the land, broken only by the steel door and a capped exhaust pipe that released faint traces of heat into the cooling air. And while some people dismissed it as eccentricity taken too far, others began to feel a quiet unease they couldn't quite name, because there was something about the way Mara worked. Methodical, precise, unconcerned with opinion, that suggested she wasn't guessing or experimenting, but following a plan she understood completely. Still, routine has a way of dulling concern, and as the first light frosts came and went without incident, the town settled back into its habits, conversations shifting away from the silo and back toward harvests, prices, and the usual rhythms of rural life, leaving Mara and her buried structure at the edge of awareness, something unusual but ultimately irrelevant, until the forecast began to change, subtly at first, a colder system than expected, a front moving faster than predicted, temperatures dipping lower than seasonal norms, details that most people acknowledged but didn't act on, because winters had always come and gone without demanding more than basic preparation, and there was no reason, at least on the surface, to believe this one would be any different, except that Mara, who had already finished building what she needed, stopped going into town entirely. Her supplies already stocked, her systems already tested, her silo sealed and waiting, while out across Harlan County, under a sky that had begun to lose its color, the rest of the town carried on as if the season ahead would follow the same familiar pattern it always had, unaware that the quiet, rusted structure they had laughed at was about to become the only place that had been built not for comfort, but for what was coming. The storm didn't arrive the way people expected. It didn't announce itself with towering clouds or sudden wind or even the usual restless shift in the air that farmers knew how to read. It came quietly, almost politely, like winter easing in a little deeper than usual. And that was exactly why no one in Harlan County realized how serious it was until it was already too late. Because by the time the temperature began to fall in any noticeable way, it wasn't just dropping, it was collapsing, slipping past the point where preparation could keep up and entering a range where ordinary systems started to fail one by one, first slowly, then all at once. The morning it began, everything looked deceptively normal. A pale gray sky stretched thin over the plains, the fields coated in a light frost that shimmered under weak sunlight, and people going about their routines as they always did, starting heaters, checking livestock, driving into town for supplies they assumed would be enough. Because the forecast had said cold, yes, but nothing beyond what Kansas winters had delivered before, and that sense of familiarity carried through most of the day, even as the air sharpened and the wind, strangely, began to disappear instead of build, leaving behind a stillness that felt heavier than calm, like the world itself was holding its breath. By late afternoon, the first signs of trouble started creeping in, subtle enough to ignore at first. Heaters running longer than usual, engines hesitating before turning over, a stiffness in door hinges and window frames that hadn't been there that morning, but still nothing that suggested what was coming. Not until the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature dropped again, faster this time, and then faster still, plunging past freezing, past the point where exposed water lines became vulnerable, and into a depth of cold that felt unnatural, almost mechanical in its precision, as if something had locked the region into a downward slide that wouldn't stop. By nightfall, the county began to fracture under it, power lines tightening and snapping with sharp, echoing cracks that carried across the flat land, transformers failing in bursts of blue light that vanished as quickly as they appeared, and one by one, homes slipping into darkness, their heating systems cutting out as electricity failed, where fuel sources thickened and stalled, and still, no wind, no snow, just cold, pressing in from every direction without resistance. Inside the Turner farmhouse, the change was immediate and unmistakable. The steady hum of their furnace cutting off mid-cycle, replaced by a silence that felt wrong, followed by the slow realization that the temperature inside was already beginning to fall, the warmth bleeding out through walls and windows that had never been designed to hold against something this relentless. And at first, they did what everyone does. They tried to fix it, checking breakers, restarting systems, switching to backup power. But the generator outside had already begun to fail, its fuel thickening in the lines, its engine struggling until it sputtered into stillness, leaving them with nothing but blankets, layered clothing, and the fragile hope that the cold would stabilize before it got worse. Across the county, the same pattern repeated, homes built for comfort rather than endurance losing ground by the minute, heat escaping faster than it could be replaced, pipes beginning to freeze. Within walls, the first cracks forming in places no one could see, and as the hours stretched on, the realization began to settle in, not as panic, but as a slow, creeping understanding that this wasn't a passing storm, wasn't something that would blow through overnight and leave inconvenience behind, but something heavier, something that had already taken control of the environment in a way people weren't prepared to fight. Sometime after midnight, the second phase began, almost without warning, as the sky, clear until then, shifted into a low, heavy cover that trapped what little heat remained, and from it came the ice, not in thick sheets at first, but in a fine, freezing rain that coated every surface it touched, turning roads into glass, locking doors shut, weighing down power lines that hadn't already failed, and sealing the landscape into something rigid and unyielding. And with it came the wind at last, not gradual but sudden, a sharp, cutting force that sliced across the plains and found every weakness left exposed, driving the cold deeper into structures already struggling to hold it back. By then, the temperature inside the Turner home had dropped into the 40s and was still falling, their breath visible in the air, their hands numb despite layers of gloves, and the realization that staying put might be more dangerous than leaving beginning to take hold, because without heat, without power, without any reliable way to stop the loss, the house itself had become a liability, a structure that could no longer protect them from the environment outside. And it was in that moment, when options narrowed to almost nothing, that something unexpected cut through the storm, not a sound, not a signal, but a sight, faint and distant across the frozen fields, a small, steady glow that shouldn't have been there, that couldn't have been there if everything else had already failed, and yet it remained, unmoving, unwavering, visible even through the shifting ice and rising wind. And it took only a few seconds for them to recognize where it was coming from. Because there was only one place in that direction, only one structure that had been built differently from the rest, something they had all dismissed without understanding, something that now, against all logic, appeared to be the only thing still functioning in a landscape that had otherwise gone silent, the old grain silo, half buried at the edge of the abandoned farm, where Mara Ellison had spent months building something no one believed she would ever need. And as the cold tightened its grip and the storm deepened into something far worse than any forecast had warned, the idea that once sounded absurd began to shift into something else entirely, something heavier, something urgent, because for the first time since the storm began, there was a possibility, however uncertain, that somewhere out there, beyond the frozen dark, a place existed that had been built not just to survive the cold, but to outlast it. By the time the Turners made the decision to leave, it no longer felt like a choice. It felt like the last narrow opening before something irreversible set in, because the cold inside their home had stopped behaving like a temporary discomfort and had become something deeper, something structural, creeping into the walls, settling into the floors, turning every surface into a slow drain on the little heat their bodies could produce. And even as they layered themselves in coats, blankets, anything they could find, it was clear the house itself had already lost the fight. Stepping outside was worse than they imagined. The air so sharp it seemed to slice through fabric and skin alike. The ground transformed into a brittle, glassy surface that cracked unpredictably beneath their boots. Each step uncertain, each breath painful, and for a moment, standing there in the frozen dark with the wind rising again around them, the idea of crossing open land felt almost impossible, but turning back wasn't an option anymore. So they fixed their eyes on the only point of reference that mattered, that faint, unwavering glow in the distance, and started moving. What should have been a short walk stretched into something far longer, not just in time, but in effort, the cold slowing their movements, the ice forcing them into careful, deliberate steps, the wind pushing against them in sudden bursts that threatened to knock them off balance entirely, and more than once they stopped, not by choice but because their bodies demanded it, lungs burning, muscles stiffening, the simple act of continuing forward becoming harder with each passing minute. Yet the light remained, constant and distant, giving them something to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. When they finally reached the silo, it didn't look like shelter. It looked sealed, silent, almost indistinguishable from the frozen earth around it except for the heavy steel door set into its side. And for a brief second, doubt crept in. The possibility that they had come all this way for nothing, that whatever had been built here might not be accessible, might not even be occupied. But there was no time left for hesitation. So Mr. Turner stepped forward and pounded against the metal, the sound dull and swallowed by the storm. Once, twice, then again with everything he had left, and just as the cold began to press in harder, as if reminding them how little time they had, something shifted on the other side. A deep, mechanical click that cut cleanly through the noise of the wind, followed by the slow, controlled movement of the door opening inward. The change was immediate and overwhelming, a wave of warm, stable air spilling out into the freezing dark, so stark in contrast that it almost felt unreal, and standing there in the doorway was Mara Ellison, calm, steady, as if the storm outside existed at a distance she didn't need to acknowledge, her expression not surprised, not alarmed, but simply expectant, as though she had known this moment would come eventually. "Get inside," she said, her voice even, leaving no room for delay, and the Turners didn't hesitate, crossing the threshold into a space that felt entirely separate from the world they had just left behind. The heavy door closing with a solid finality that cut off the wind and the cold in an instant, reducing the storm to nothing more than a distant, muffled presence. Inside, the silo revealed itself not as the hollow structure everyone had imagined, but as something carefully engineered, its curved walls thick and layered, the interior divided into levels connected by a reinforced staircase, every surface designed with purpose, from the insulated panels that held the temperature steady to the compact systems tucked neatly into place, battery banks providing consistent power, a contained water supply protected from freezing, a heat source that radiated evenly without fluctuation, and perhaps most striking of all was the stability of it, not just warmth but consistency, a controlled environment that didn't react to the chaos outside, didn't struggle or fluctuate, but simply held its ground. Mrs. Turner looked around, still trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had expected, her voice unsteady as she asked, "How is this even possible?" And Mara, already moving to retrieve blankets and something warm to drink, answered without hesitation, "Because it's not fighting the storm, it's ignoring it." And when Mr. Turner glanced back toward the door, as if expecting to hear the wind forcing its way through, he realized there was nothing, no drafts, no rattling, no sign of strain at all, just a faint, distant pressure that never reached them. As the hours passed, and the worst of the storm tightened its grip outside, others began to arrive. First one, then two, then more, drawn by the same faint light, the same realization that the usual ways of enduring winter had failed, and each time the door opened, it was the same, cold and chaos outside, warmth and control within, Mara letting them in without question, without comment, simply adjusting the space, organizing supplies, maintaining the balance she had built into the structure from the beginning. At one point, as they all settled into a rhythm of waiting, conserving energy, and listening to the distant force of the storm that no longer threatened them directly, Mr. Turner finally asked the question that had been building in his mind since the moment they arrived. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" And Mara paused, just long enough to consider the wording before replying. "I knew something would come eventually," her tone not defensive or proud, just factual. And when he followed with, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she met his gaze steadily and said, "Would it have changed anything?" And the silence that followed answered for him, "Because deep down, They both understood that warnings without proof rarely change behavior, especially when they challenge what people are used to believing. For days later, when the storm finally loosened its grip and emergency crews began to reach the outer edges of the county, the damage told a clear story. Homes fractured by cold, systems that had failed under pressure, structures that had been designed for comfort but not for endurance. And standing among them, almost unnoticed at first because of how seamlessly it blended into the land, was the silo, unchanged, intact, its door opening once more to a world that had finally begun to move again. And as the people who had taken shelter inside stepped back out into the pale, frozen light of morning, their perspective had shifted in a way that didn't require explanation, because the thing they had dismissed, the thing they had laughed at, had not only worked, it had endured without compromise. And in the weeks that followed, as repairs began and conversations turned from what had happened to what could be done differently, a quiet change took hold across Harlan County, visible not in words but in actions. In the way new structures were planned, in the way materials were chosen, in the way people started to think beyond what had always been done. And out on the edge of the old farm, Mara Ellison continued her routine as she always had, the silo standing as it was built to stand, not as a curiosity anymore, not as a joke, but as something understood, something respected, because after the worst storm anyone could remember had come and gone, leaving behind proof written in ice and damage, there was only one thing no one questioned anymore. She had been right, and the shelter hidden inside that old grain silo had been ready long before anyone else realized it needed to exist.